Tom Pauken. It's an honor to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Fred, and I appreciate the fine job you're doing down in Austin in a tough year. And I want you to know, as chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission, we only have a small IT staff. We have cut our budget, and we're pleased to do so. You know, watching all those clips, my former boss, Ronald Reagan, brought back so many wonderful memories. I'm often one to say that, you know, the liberals love to talk about the Kennedy administration. When I was in college, a young Texan at the time, and the Camelot period. I view the Reagan administration, particularly the first term where I had the opportunity to be both on the White House staff and run a federal agency, as our conservative version of Camelot. It was a marvelous time. And it is so wonderful to see those memories. And all of us who speak from time to time, we steal from Ronald Reagan. You know, I chair the Texas Workforce Commission these days at the behest of Governor Perry. I've been out of government since I left the Reagan administration until he asked me to come back in a couple of years ago. It's the equivalent of the U.S. Department of Labor in Texas. So we deal with the unemployment issue, and obviously this is the most serious period of time since the time of the Great Depression. And nationally, although we're doing better than anybody else, it's still a tough time. But quite frankly, I often call Ronald Reagan, and quote Ronald Reagan's statement to the effect that he had to deal with high unemployment. Well, he had a plan that worked, unlike this administration. But he had an expression which he liked to use, and I borrowed on occasion. He said, a recession is when your neighbor's out of work, a depression is when you're out of work. And there's a lot of truth to that. But Paul asked me to talk a little bit about my memories of Ronald Reagan. And I'm going to date myself a little bit because I see some of the students from Texas A&M who are here. And I think back to myself as a young Texan in Washington, D.C. I was at Georgetown University. I wrote a book called Conscience of a Conservative, and I was very fortunate in 1964 to be asked to work in the Goldwater for President campaign in Washington, D.C. at the Republican National Committee. So I went back in the summer and in the fall semester. My grades suffered a little bit, but I was working in the Goldwater for President campaign. But even though I was all for Barry Goldwater, I got to say, it looked pretty bleak. Those of you who are older than myself remember that we were getting killed. Johnson was clearly going to win, as he ultimately did in the landslide. And so I was pretty depressed around September. I think it was around that time, when all of a sudden there was a decision made to have a 30-minute television address by a man named Ronald Reagan. And I think they had the clip a little earlier of part of that speech, but it was a marvelous talk. And I remember watching it, and I said, there's the man who is going to really lead the conservative movement after all of this is over and lead this country back. And I never knew how long it would take. It took 16 years from 1964 to 1980 for Ronald Reagan to be nominated and win the presidency. And unfortunately, our problems are a lot more serious now. We don't have 16 years to wait. But nonetheless, it was remarkable that out of that Goldwater campaign, out of that defeat, was my first exposure, and the first exposure of so many Americans across the country to the philosophy and the man, Ronald Reagan. We knew him as an actor, but we didn't know him in terms of a man who was such a principled conservative. A year or more later, I'd been elected national chairman of the College of Republicans, traveling around the country, speaking to different groups, and I had the good fortune to be out at the University of Southern California and follow then candidate for Governor Ronald Reagan on a platform. I had a chance to spend a little time with him. And the thing that struck me, and those of us who've been in politics, around politics for a long time, you know, it's the good and the bad, even on our own side. And occasionally some of our people get to Washington, after a few years, they begin to believe their own press clippings that their press secretaries write for them. And I think that the American people saw that and threw a bunch of people out, like Chet Edward. And very full of themselves and lost touch with the people. But the thing that struck me the first time I personally met Ronald Reagan is this was a man who was a real gentleman, a man who came across as someone of good heart, and that always struck me. I remember running in 1978. Fred was talking a little earlier about voter ID. I wish we had it back in 1978. I ran against incumbent Congressman Jim Maddox, lost by about 800 votes, and we had a few thousand of those dead people voting up in Dallas at the time. But nonetheless, he came in to campaign for me in Garland, Texas, and we were at a Holiday Inn. It was a little bigger than this room, but let me tell you, it was an overflow crowd, and we had gotten a little bit of publicity out about it. But what a marvelous speech, and again, how considerate he was of the people that were there. And I could tell right then that this man was destined to be President of the United States. And then I had the good fortune to work on his transition team in 1980. And I think one of the most, there are two things that hit me immediately. It was alluded to a little bit earlier. From day one, when he was inaugurated, from day one, he immediately put in action a plan to address the issues facing our country. And we had enormously serious problems back then. 10% unemployment, double-digit inflation, Soviets kicking us around the globe. We had Henry Kissinger, the so-called expert on foreign policy, saying we're on the losing side of the Cold War and we better cut the best deal possible. We had the communists taking over in Central America. They had taken Nicaragua, the Sandinistas. They were about to take El Salvador, but from day one, and I remember this vividly, Reagan got in and we supported the anti-communist government in El Salvador, and we began to move it back in the other direction. One of the most memorable early days that I had the good fortune of being on the White House lawn when he welcomed the hostages back from Iran. And some of you may remember back during the Carter administration, we had what was called the post-Vietnam malaise. Now give me a break. I was in Vietnam. My frustration was over the McNamara policy, the way we fought the war, the micromanagement from Washington, a war that if it had been fought the right way, we would have won. And I was absolutely disgusted with the post-Vietnam malaise of Jimmy Carter. I sure didn't feel that way. I was just upset at what had happened. But nonetheless, I listened to the President that day. He didn't speak very long, probably 10 minutes or so, as he welcomed the hostages back from around. But you know, it was like a cloud that was lifted. All of that was over. America was back. As I see events today, America needs to be back again.
Yeah.
Then a few months later, it was really March 30th, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I was still on the White House council staff over in the executive office building, and all of a sudden we got word the president had been shot. And we didn't know for a while. I raced over to the counsel's office at the White House council. Brett Fielding, who was his counsel at the time, was downstairs in the room trying to, we're trying to sort out, what's happened. The vice president was out of town. The president had been shot, trying to put all of the proper rules, laws, statutes, appropriate actions that needed to be taken. Of course, then we're watching on TV while this is going on, and Al Haig gets up there and tells everybody he's in charge as we look around the room. But nonetheless, it was a scary moment, and it was so close to losing such a great president. But I didn't know this at the time. I didn't know this until much later when I read a book called Reagan and God. And it was Ronald Reagan who said shortly after the shooting, and he didn't make a big deal about it, he didn't wear his religion on his sleeves, but he said, quote, "I have decided that whatever time I have left is for him. Whatever happens now, I owe my life to God, and will try to serve him every way I can," quote. I was so proud to work for a president who had discernment, a deep faith in God, and the civic courage to stand up for what was right, no matter whether the political elites agreed with him or not, no matter what the polls said. He did what he did based on what he thought was for the good of the country. And how badly we need that kind of civic leadership today. And then I think back to the fall of 1981. And one of my frustrations coming back from Vietnam, most of us just came home, we'd done our job there, went back into civilian life, raised families. But there was this frustration that came out of us being demonized. Part of our own generation, which literally supported the other side in the war, called us everything from baby killers to drug-crazed psychos to victims. There was a rash of movies in the 70s. I call them, Vietnam, Psycho on the Loose, round up all the usual suspects, Vietnam veteran. And this depiction of Vietnam veterans, this mythology that was pushed by the hard left, part of my generation, that literally supported the other side in that war. And so I was so proud when the President agreed to support a program called the Vietnam Veteran Leadership Program, because a lot of our own people were confused at the time. Literally, you'd have people who served in Vietnam and wouldn't even put it on their resumes because they felt it would hurt them, or somehow that was a negative feeling. A few years later, there were a lot of people beginning to put it on their resume who hadn't served in Vietnam. But in the fall of 1981, again, we were on the White House lawn as the President kicked off a program called the Vietnam Veteran Leadership Program, run entirely by Vietnam veterans, those of us who had served, to help our fellow veterans who were underemployed, unemployed, or had lingering problems associated with that Vietnam experience. And literally, Ronald Reagan brought us home. He brought the Vietnam veterans home. And I remember a year or so later, we were in the White House inside that time, and I had the honor of presenting him a plaque, making him an honorary Vietnam veteran. And again, he didn't speak long, but just like you've seen from the clips today, and I was reminded, it was very moving words at Normandy, very moving words as he paid a tribute to the people who served. He welcomed us back that day. And I think of a man named Les Higa who told me later that evening, a Japanese American from Hawaii who came back to Vietnam and was subject to all kinds of slurs and attacks. He said, "I never thought I'd be in the White House someday and have the President of the United States thanking me for our service to our country." But that was Ronald Reagan. That was the man. He wasn't just reading a script. He wasn't just reading the words. And just like Roger Williams said it a little earlier, you could feel this man was speaking from his heart. And he was speaking from his heart to us. And that was the kind of man I worked for. And finally, I would say that there are certain things that we need to remember as we go forward in 2012. And one of the things Ronald Reagan did, we had the good fortune of having a man who was a principled leader, but he also brought a team of outsiders with him, experienced outsiders, but who had principled conservative views and who were determined to come to Washington and drain the swamps, in the President's words. And that's so badly needed today. The boldness, because what we had, it wasn't just talking points, it wasn't just rhetoric, and let's be frank, on both sides there's too much of that these days. There were serious solutions based on our conservative principles for the serious problems of our time. And that's our responsibility these days, whether in Austin or in Washington, to come up with serious solutions to the most serious problems I've seen in my lifetime facing this nation. And I don't say that because we've been through a lot, but we can fix things. There are people who have despaired and who have given up, but you haven't. We have to stay involved, and the American people have. And what was so encouraging to me, it wasn't the big banks, it wasn't the big Wall Street crowd that got behind Barry Goldwater in '64, got behind Ronald Reagan in 1980. It was the grassroots. It was a bottom-up phenomenon. And that's happening again, and that's an encouraging sign. It was a marvelous period of time in my lifetime. I left in 1985. I thought that all was well with the world. We're in tough times, but never lose hope, because I walked in, I think back to the transition team, I think back to those early days, and I said, gosh, the problems are so enormous. How can a president and the people he brings with him possibly turn this thing around? We did, and we can do it again.
That's right.
Thanks to the leadership.